everybody, welcome back. We're going to talk about chapter 4 of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum today. I hope you've been enjoying the other episodes. A few people have told me that now they want to buy this book, and I do highly recommend that. It's excellent, and even better if you're a parent and you would like to buy the book, because I think that this information is super prevalent to parents and important, especially white parents, because we are often missing anti-racism education because we feel like we don't know enough about it. But I do think it's helpful for everyone, and you are supporting a Black woman author by buying the book. So I, as always, highly recommend to purchase it if you have the ability to do so. So we will get started. Chapter 4 is identity development in adolescence, and the quote at the beginning of the chapter is, "Why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria?" So what the whole book was named after. She starts off the book by saying that if you walk into any high school, that you will see likely in the cafeteria Black kids sitting together, white kids sitting together. And sometimes there will be a mixture, but most of the time there is at least one table where most of the kids are Black. And it says that this happens in the 6th or 7th grade, she says. We know in developmental psychology, identity develops in adolescence. So you're asking, who am I? And trying to figure out who you are not. And I'm going to put this as a journal prompt in the notes, but she says, as I write this, I can hear the voice of a white woman who asks me, well, all adolescents struggle with questions of identity. They all become more self-conscious about their appearance and more concerned about what their peers think. So what is so different for Black kids? And she says, of course, she is right that all adolescents look at themselves in new ways, but not all adolescents think about themselves in racial terms. And we know that to be correct. She talks about James Marcia, who described 4 identity statuses to characterize the variation in identity. One of those is diffuse, a state in which there has been little exploration or active consideration of a particular domain and no psychological commitment. So you haven't really thought about it, considered it, and so psychologically you are not committed to that process. Then she talks about number 2 is foreclosed, a state in which a commitment has been made to particular roles or belief systems, often those selected by parents, without actively considering alternatives. So for me, this especially made me think of political values and taking those from your parents, at least at first, until you really start to figure out, like, what do I believe? I remember even when I had turned 18, I believe it was the first time Obama ran for president, I voted for John McCain. And that's because my parents have always been Republican. And, in hindsight, like, he's a good guy. So it wasn't the worst selection that I could have voted Republican. In my viewpoint, we all have different political beliefs, and that's okay. But even now, it wasn't way far off from my values to vote for him. But the reason that I did vote for him is just because I had heard what my parents said and what their values were. I respected them, and so I voted for McCain. Now, by Obama's second election, I had done some soul searching and thinking for myself and realized that my values did not align as much with the Republican Party. And I've talked about this in TikTok videos before, but I actually discovered this by taking a Facebook quiz, because Facebook was one of the most popular social media platforms at the time. And so I took this quiz that said, like, what political party are you? And it said, when I took it, it was like 90-something% Democrat. And I was like, how interesting. And then it broke it down. It was like, because you answered this way and you believe this, that makes you most in line with the Democratic values. And I did agree with all of those things. I think we should help people and treat others with kindness. And I don't care if I have to pay more taxes if kids can eat food, or if families can be at least secure enough that their basic needs are met. And so I realized that I was Democrat. And so I think I voted Democrat going forward, like from then on, from Obama's second term on. So it was interesting. And my, obviously, sense of self and identity has continued to evolve and improve as I've gotten older. Yeah, but anyway, so that is the foreclosed state, what I was in during Obama's first run for president. The third is moratorium, which is a state of active exploration of roles and beliefs in which no commitment has yet been made. So you're actively exploring, but you haven't really made a commitment yet. So maybe when I took that Facebook quiz and I was like, what are my values? And again, this is a very surface level example of this. We go through this from the time we're younger, and I had multiple periods. It was just the easiest one for me to kind of break down for anybody that might be confused. And then the fourth state is achieved, which is a state of strong personal commitment to a particular dimension of identity following a period of high exploration. So you really explore what you think, what you believe, and then you have committed very strongly to that. Like, this is who I am. And I do think some people can overcorrect a little bit in the achieved state by thinking that everybody else should also have your viewpoint. And I have done that myself at times, like, oh, well, I don't want anyone in my life that doesn't align with my values and my beliefs and my identity. But as we grow older, I think, and do more exploration, it depends on the issue. It depends on the scenario itself. But I think we can allow for more grace once we are very strong in our personal beliefs and convictions. And I do believe that I have gone through multiple phases, and my identity continues to grow and evolve. And I think that that's good. I think we should always be growing and increasing our awareness. Once we're, fully committed to that, we can feel more confident in who we are. And we project that to others as well. It says an individual is not likely to explore all identity domains at once. Therefore, it is not unusual for an adolescent to be actively exploring one dimension while another remains relatively unexamined. Given the impact of dominant and subordinate status, it is not surprising that researchers have found that adolescents of color are more likely to be actively engaged in an exploration of their racial or ethnic identity than are white adolescents. Why do Black youths in particular think about themselves in terms of race? Because that is how the rest of the world thinks of them. Our self-perceptions are shaped by the messages that we receive from those around us. So we've talked about this in the previous chapters, the dominant and submissive, and how many of us are a part of multiple groups. And that, I believe that was in chapter 1. I believe it was chapter 1, if not chapter 2. And we're actively exploring different dimensions. And then we also talked about, I believe in the last chapter we did, chapter 3, about how people mirror and what people see in us is mirrored back to us. And so she gives an example of this if you're confused. She says, a case in point, when my son David was 7, if asked to describe himself, he would have told you many things. I'm smart. I like to play computer games. I have an older brother. Near the top of his list, he would likely have mentioned, I'm tall for my age. At 7, he probably would not have mentioned that he is Black or African American, though he certainly knew that about himself and his family. Why would he mention his height and not his racial group membership? As a child, when David met new adults, one of the first questions they asked was, how old are you? When David stated his age, the inevitable reply was, gee, you're tall for your age. It happened so frequently that I once overheard 7-year-old David say to someone, don't say it, I know I'm tall for my age. Height was salient for David because it was salient for others. When David met new adults, they didn't say, gee, you're Black for your age. If you're saying to yourself, of course they didn't, think again. Imagine David at 15, 6'2", wearing the adolescent attire of the day, passing adults he doesn't know on the sidewalk. Would the women hold their purses a little tighter, maybe even cross the street to avoid him? Would he hear the sound of the automatic door locks on cars as he passes by? Would he be followed around by the security guards at the local mall? As he stopped in town with his new bicycle, would a police officer hassle him, asking where he got it, implying that it might be stolen? Would strangers assume he plays basketball? Each of these experiences would convey a racial message. At 7, race was not yet salient for David because it was not yet salient for society. But later it would be. That was really interesting to me, and also reiterates what I've been saying throughout reading this book and really thinking about throughout reading this book, which is that it's so important that as white parents, we talk to our children about race. And I say white parents because Black parents have been doing this for years and years and years and years. Like, we are the ones, as we talked about at the beginning of the book, we are the ones that think that race is something that should not be discussed or not talked about. That speaking about our whiteness or saying Black people is somehow hushed or like a bad word, which furthers the narrative. So it's not just what we say, but what we don't say. And she talked about that toward the beginning of the book. And that is very evident here, because if we're never talking to kids that way, we're not going to have the perceptions, because they are shaped by those around us. And especially if we aren't in a super diverse community. So like most of my friends growing up were white kids. That's just how the cookie crumbled. And so if no one around us is going to broaden our view of the world and experiences, our perceptions are only shaped by this small little bubble that we're in. And so I highlighted that as a journal prompt to put in the notes, the part asking, what self-perceptions do you think were shaped by messages that you receive from those around you? And that's very interesting to think about. And I'm not even sure how I answer this question. I've been trying to ponder, but I think it's a really good thing for us to think about and journal about, because I think if we look back, at least for myself, that I can probably think of things even from childhood that I've carried with me that I think are a part of my identity, but that I never really fully accepted, embraced, and committed to. It was more told about me from others. Like I was called dramatic as a child or extra sensitive. Later in my adulthood, I've realized now that a lot of that was likely undiagnosed autism. Once I received my diagnosis, it was kind of like a huge aha moment for me about so many things, like crying when I got pizza sauce on my finger and thinking it was blood, like maybe a sensory thing. I thought for a long time that I was dramatic, that I was overly dramatic. And I think I just internalized that from hearing other people say, like, she's dramatic. Because really, I'm pretty even keeled. Like, I'm not a very dramatic person, I don't think. I don't think any of my friends would describe me that way today. And even as a kid, like, I was pretty chill. I liked reading, I was introverted, but dramatic? I don't think so. Yeah. And I'm thinking about this as I'm talking. And I hope that you're thinking of some things too that you were told that you're like, was that true though? Or did I just internalize it because it was perceived by the people around me? Things to think about. And then that last part was a green highlight, imagining David at 15, 6'2", passing adults he doesn't know on the sidewalk and how people would treat him differently and what they would think. And that part made me feel sad. I do know that that is a very real reality with racism and the systemic white supremacy that our country has that is so prevalent. But reading it in that way, like with her talking about her 7-year-old son and then thinking about how she already knows that eventually it's going to be different for him once he goes through those experiences and like sees those perceptions and sees how people act around him, he's going to then start to perceive himself in that way as well. And race does become a topic of conversation and part of his identity. She talks about researchers from the Ethnic and Racial Identity in the 21st Century Study Group, William Cross and Binta Cross, asserting that, quote, racial, ethnic, and cultural identity overlap at the level of lived experience, end quote, to the point that there is little reason to discuss them separately. So what in the past were referred to as models of racial identity development are now described and better understood as racial cultural identity or racial ethnic cultural REC identity models. So that's something that's changed in the past because lived experience involves all of those things together. So it only made sense to discuss them together. She says that most children of color are socialized to develop an identity that integrates competencies for transacting race, ethnicity, and culture in everyday life. So she talks about how from early childhood through the pre-adolescent years, Black children are exposed to and absorb many of the beliefs and values of the dominant white culture, including the idea that whites are the preferred group in U.S. society. The stereotypes, omissions, and distortions that reinforce notions of white superiority are breathed in by Black children as well as white. She talks about when the environmental cues change and the world begins to reflect their Blackness back to them more clearly, they begin to develop a new social understanding of their own REC group membership and what that means for them and others. During adolescence, their understanding evolves to include not just more about themselves, but also more about their group, including an understanding of a common fate or shared destiny based on ethnic or racial group membership, and that these shared experiences differ from the experiences of individuals from other groups. Transition to this new understanding is typically precipitated by an event or series of events that force the young person to acknowledge the personal impact of racism. She said usually the focus process of examination based on research of one's racial or ethnic identity may begin as early as middle or junior high school. And she talks about how white students did begin to think about their ethnic identity, but there was in the research evidence to suggest a more active search among Black students, especially Black girls. She talks about in education, disproportionate access. So a study of Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District in North Carolina. She talks about Rosalind Mickelson comparing the placements of Black and white high school students who had similar scores on a national standardized achievement test they took in the 6th grade. So they scored similarly, which indicates a similar level of education. More than half of the white students who scored in the 90th to 99th percentile on the test were enrolled in high school advanced placement AP or international baccalaureate IB English, while only 20% of the Black students who also scored in the 90th to 99th percentile were enrolled in these more rigorous courses. Meanwhile, 35% of white students whose test scores were below the 70th percentile were taking AP or IB English. Only 9% of Black students who scored below the 70th percentile had access to the more advanced curriculum. Those statistics, I was like, wow. I mean, that's wild. Like, more than half of white students who scored very, very high were enrolled in AP or IB English, and 20% of Black students with the same scores were enrolled in those advanced classes. And then people that scored very low, 35% of white students were still taking the AP or IB English, but only 9% of Black students with the same lower scores had access to the more advanced curriculum. I mean, those statistics are staggering. She goes on to talk about what we started talking about on the page previously, which is examining your cultural identity and how, white students are doing this, but Black students, especially Black girls, start doing this earlier by middle or junior high school. And she goes on to talk about social scientists Bonnie Ross Leadbeater and Niobe Way, pointing out, quote, the school dropout, the teenage welfare mother, the drug addict, and the victim of domestic violence or of AIDS are among the most prevalent public images of poor and working class urban adolescent girls. Yet despite the risks inherent in economic disadvantage, the majority of poor urban adolescent girls who do not fit the stereotypes that are made about them. Resisting the stereotypes and affirming other definitions of themselves is part of the task facing young Black women in both white and Black communities. That task has been made more complicated for Black adolescent girls because they are continually confronted with hypersexualized and other negative representation of Black women in the popular culture. So it's not that white girls and white women don't go through these aspects of identity searching, but we do not have the task of being confronted with these images of ourselves that are so hypersexualized or just negative connotations in general. And when we are confronted with these generalizations, for instance, when Black women come on social media and say, hey, white women, blah, 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 like how quickly does every single white woman, why are you generalizing us? Like, the white fragility just really shines through. And white people in general do this, not just women. White men are also guilty of this for sure. But I think white women just come in droves to combat that identity, not thinking about how much easier it was for us to develop our own identity as an adolescent because of what we're seeing all around us in the media, social media. Like, we see white influencers making it big. We see white models, and those also speak on more than one ism, like ableism, because most images that we see are able-bodied, skinny, white women, right? Like, that's the societal norm to which I guess we're all supposed to fit. And if you don't, then it's fine, but you're probably not going to amount to much. That's the narrative that I feel like society gives off. Yeah. And so then she goes on to talk about increasingly online racial discrimination is impacting adolescents of color. According to a Pew Research Center study of teens and technology, at least 95% of American youth have access to the internet, and adolescents of color spend a lot of time using it, 4.5 more hours per day on average than their white peers. In a large, comprehensive study of a diverse group of adolescents over a 3-year 4-year period, 2010 to 2013, more than half of the adolescents of color had experienced an act of online racial discrimination directed at them, defined as, quote, denigrating or excluding individuals or groups on the basis of race through the use of symbols, voice, video, images, text, and graphic representations. These experiences include racial epithets, and unfair treatment by others due to a person's racial or ethnic background, such as being excluded from an online space. More than 2/3 had witnessed an act of online racial discrimination directed at someone else. She says that the adolescents of color in the study included a mix of African American, Latinx, Asian, and biracial teens. Researchers found that African American youth experienced, quote, a particularly virulent form of online racial discrimination, end quote, on such popular online platforms as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. There was another report from a student that said almost every day on Call of Duty Black Ops, a video game involving other online players, I see Confederate flags, swastikas, and black people hanging from trees and emblems, and they say racist things about me and my teammates. She says in these examples, the intrusion of racism into young people's lives comes uninvited and across all physical boundaries into their own homes through an Xbox or a computer, or into the palms of their hands through their smartphones, often from unknown sources. So it just really highlights even more than we're already aware of about how, I see so much racism, especially once I started deconstructing on social media every day. But you don't think about how, at least I didn't think about how these things are affecting adolescents even more. Like, I always thought of the boys, the moms that have to teach their boys what to do if they get pulled over by a police officer, or what to do if a white woman does something problematic. They have to give them these warnings, but you don't think about them just innocently playing video games in their living room or their bedroom and having these images and words, racist words and hatred ingrained into them, just like thrown at them. And that's so heartbreaking to me. Because we do think about it in things like social media, but at least for me, I hadn't fully considered like all of the little ways that can happen. She talks about imagining your own response when you're upset. Somebody asks you what's wrong and you explain why you're offended, and then in some instances in response, they brush off your complaint, say you're oversensitive. Like, what happens when someone does that to you? When feelings, rational or irrational, are invalidated, most people disengage. They not only choose to discontinue the conversation, but are more likely to turn to someone who will understand their perspective. In much the same way, the 8th grade girl's white friend doesn't get it. She doesn't see the significance of this racial message. But the girls at the black table do. When they go to that table, she talks about how, you know what, Mr. Smith said the same thing to me yesterday. They get it. And so the black students turn to each other for the much needed support they are not likely to find anywhere else. And that was so interesting to me because it makes so much sense. Like, how often, that's why there are all these different communities, even on social media. Like, I think that that's a really, a good example for those of us that haven't been in high school for a very long time. But we even see that in movies and TV shows. A lot of high schools are in these cliques, like the jocks, the band geeks. And I'm just using the terms that are like used in movies. This is not based on my personal beliefs. The drama kids, the popular girls, or the mean girls. And there's all these different groups. And it's because they all have these things in common. They can understand each other's experience because they play sports, or they all are in the band. They're all in drama. And stereotypically, and as we know, some of these groups are more likely to experience bullying than others. And it's the same thing with race. When white supremacy and racism is so prevalent in our society, they need to find people who have things in common with them, who understand their experience, and especially these very hurtful experiences that are far too common. In response to that, and she talks about, they theorize that the anger and resentment that adolescents feel in response to their growing awareness of the systematic exclusion of Black people from full participation in U.S. society leads to the development of an oppositional social identity. So they talk about how she quotes Fordham and Ogbu, who wrote, "Subordinate minorities regard certain forms of behavior and certain activities or events, symbols, and meanings as not appropriate for them because those behaviors, events, symbols, and meanings are characteristic of white Americans. At the same time, they emphasize other forms of behavior as more appropriate for them because these are not a part of white Americans' way of life. To behave in the manner defined as falling within a white cultural frame of reference is to act white and is negatively sanctioned." So, for instance, if you were a student in high school and you feel that anger and resentment that we would all feel if people continue to devalue our experiences, our very real lived experiences, and you're aware of the systematic exclusion that's taking place all the time, they very justifiably so become angry, resentful, and develop oppositional social identity. And that is when they'll want to use more AV than sounding white. And I'd say that with quotes, because that's going to be negatively sanctioned. So she goes on to kind of talk about certain styles of speech, dress, and music are embraced as, quote, authentically Black, end quote, and those become highly valued, while attitudes and behaviors associated with white people are viewed with disdain. And how she talks about how powerful the adolescents peer groups view about what is Black and what is not has a huge impact on their behavior. And it probably depends on where you live, like what district, what does the school look like, that kind of thing, on what is seen as Black or white. She said, "We need to understand that in racially mixed settings, racial grouping is a developmental process in response to an environmental stressor, racism. Joining with one's peers for support in the face of stress is a positive coping strategy. What is problematic is that the young people are operating with a very limited definition of what it means to be Black, based largely on cultural stereotypes." She talks about other things that's more for Black parents to be aware of in here, which I'm going to skip over because that's not my conversation to have or be a part of. But she does describe racelessness in racially mixed schools, and she defines racelessness where individuals assimilate into the dominant group by de-emphasizing characteristics that might identify them as members of the subordinate group. And she talks about one student who traveled outside his home community with his white teammates. He sometimes encountered overt racism. "I quickly realized that I'm Black, and that's the thing they're going to see first, no matter how much I try to de-emphasize my Blackness." That line was really powerful for me. Actually, I need to highlight. I just realized I didn't highlight that one. Highlight complete. And she says, "Instead, a Black student can play down his or her Black identity in order to succeed in school and mainstream institutions without rejecting his or her Black identity and culture. Instead of becoming raceless, an achieving Black student can become an emissary, which is someone who sees his or her own achievements as advancing the cause of the racial group." So you want to almost represent your race in the face of other people's stereotypes, is how she describes that. She says at the end of this section, "These examples make clear that an oppositional identity can potentially interfere with academic achievement, but that is not always the case. There are alternative responses that can lead to academic success. It may be tempting for educators to blame the adolescents themselves for their academic disinterest in instances where that occurs. However, the questions that educators and other concerned adults must ask are these: what is it about the curriculum and the culture of academic opportunity within the school that reinforces the notion that academic excellence is a largely white domain? What curricular interventions might we use to encourage the development of an empowered emissary identity?" And I think this is a question that I'm going to put in the journal prompts for us all to think about, because even not being educators, we can think about what we can do in our families, with our children, with our loved ones in general, to make sure that we are reinforcing academic excellence, not only for white people. And one of the biggest things that I can think of off the top of my head that we can do is education, teaching kids about these powerful and successful Black leaders. And I'm not just talking about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., like people that are frequently discussed, but there are so many more Black people that have done absolutely incredible and amazing things. And not only do we not learn enough about them in our schools, but in many states and as part of the Republican agenda right now, we are actively trying to make sure that we are not teaching about. And if you're somebody watching this that is like, oh, that's not true, I want you to really look up, not from like a certain website, but from one of the education websites, not like the Moms of Liberty site or like Fox News. But I really want you to look up what CRT is, critical race theory. And I think if you actually do and you look into it and give it some time and attention and research, I think you will find, as I did, that it should be something, like it should not be a debate. And the fact that it is, or that it's seen with a negative connotation, is very problematic because it should be the way that education is in general. It should be the norm, and it's not. And that's because of white supremacy. She talks about the search for alternative images. If young people are exposed to images of African American academic achievement in their early years, as they look ahead to see what older students are achieving, or as they read about the accomplishments and contributions of a diverse group of women and men in their textbooks, they will be less likely to define school success as something for whites only. They will know that there is a long history of Black intellectual achievement. She says, as we have seen, John, which was one of the Black students that she mentioned earlier that we read a quote from, felt he had to distance himself from his Black peers in order to be successful in high school. He was one of the kids not sitting at the Black table. Continued encounters with racism and access to new culturally relevant information empowered him to give up his racelessness and become an emissary. In college, not only did he sit at the Black table, but he emerged as a campus leader, confident in the support of his Black peers. His example illustrates that one's presence at the Black table is often an expression of one's identity development, which evolves over time. Just as we don't all reach puberty and begin developing sexual interests at the same time, REC group identity development unfolds in idiosyncratic ways. She says, though my research suggests that early adolescence is a common time for Black students to begin actively identifying with their REC group, one's own life experiences are also important determinants of the timing. Young people whose racial identity development is out of sync with their peers often feel in an awkward position. Adolescents are notoriously egocentric and assume that their experience is the same as everyone else's. Just as girls who have become interested in boys become disdainful of their friends still interested in dolls, the Black teens who are at the table can be quite judgmental toward those who are not. Quote, if I think it is a sign of authentic Blackness to sit at this table, then you should too, end quote. So she talks about how young Black men and women who still hang around with white classmates that they grew up with or knew since early childhood, they may be snubbed by their Black peers. And she said the dynamic is particularly apparent in regional schools where children from a variety of neighborhoods are brought together. When Black children from predominantly white neighborhoods go to school with Black children from predominantly Black neighborhoods, the former group are often viewed as trying to be white by the latter. We all speak the language of the streets we live on. Black children living in white neighborhoods often sound white to their Black peers from across town and may be teased because of it. This can be a very painful experience, particularly when the young person is not fully accepted as part of the white peer group either. And as we've learned throughout this book and throughout this chapter, even if you are on the surface accepted by that white peer group, you're going to continue to see messages that you are not the same as that peer group. Like when you're riding out with your friends as a teenager and you get pulled over and the Black student that was hanging out with all the white kids is the only one getting questioned by the police. Just like one example. And so the messages that you are going to be receiving, even if the white kids are very accepting and y'all are great friends, you've known each other forever, the messages that you're going to see portrayed and coming at you constantly are going to tell you that you are not the same as that white group because white supremacy. And that's why we have to make such a concerted effort to not only deconstruct for ourselves and really look inward, but educate our children on those things as well. And she said, as one's awareness of the daily challenges of living in a racist society increases, it is immensely beneficial to be able to share one's experiences with others who have lived them. Even when white friends are willing and able to listen and bear witness to one's struggles, they cannot really share the experience. And I just think that makes complete sense. Like, chronically ill people or people with cancer, join support groups. And I'm not comparing being Black to having these things at all. I'm just trying to give an example to white people of things that you experience, and you're looking for a support group of people that have the same lived experiences that understand. And that's why it's so problematic, in my opinion, for us to continue to insert ourselves in conversations where we don't belong and that have nothing to do with us, because we think that like centering ourselves somehow is helpful, and it just doesn't make sense. It's similar to the when Black Lives Matter was really big and the All Lives Matter came out. Like, really? Or the Blue Lives Matter came out. And it's like, come on, guys. That would be like if I was going to a breast cancer awareness rally event and I was like, how dare you? What about lung cancer? And wore all my lung cancer attire. Like, nobody is saying that other things don't exist and that other issues don't exist, but it is not the norm, and it's not the most important conversation that we should be having. And I would say when white people are involved, most times that's the case. So she talks about that most Black parents want their children to achieve an internalized sense of personal security, to be able to acknowledge the reality of racism and to respond effectively to it, even though they don't always use the language of racial identity development theory to describe that. She says our educational institutions should do what they can to encourage this development rather than impede it. When I talk to educators about the need to provide adolescents with identity-affirming experiences and information about their own cultural groups, they sometimes flounder because this information has not been part of their own education. Their understanding of adolescent development has been limited to the white middle-class norms included in most textbooks. Their knowledge of Black history limited to Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. They sometimes say with frustration that parents should provide this kind of education for their children. Unfortunately, Black parents often attended the same schools the teachers did and have the same informational gaps. We need to acknowledge that an important part of interrupting the cycle of oppression is constant re-education and then sharing what we learn with the next generation. I love it so much. I love that. And that's my whole goal in doing this, is discussing this with my white comrades, but also in hopes that, especially with this book particularly, I'm very passionate about education for myself, obviously, and others, and constantly re-educating. But I think the passing it to future generations is something that is not as much the norm as it should be. And especially with all of the propaganda and misinformation regarding CRT, and in some states banned books, many of which are written by Black people or discuss issues regarding slavery, oppression, political decisions. And we're seeing those things be suppressed instead of talked about more. And so it's something that we just have to commit to ourselves and pass the message along. Tell your parent friends, like, oh yeah, today we're playing a game so that we can learn more about Black history. Because I think it's so important that kids learn about that, since Black history is American history. Can't have one without the other. She talks about a condition known as stereotype threat, which is defined by social psychologist Claude Steele, which is the threat of being viewed through the lens of a negative stereotype or the fear of doing something that would inadvertently confirm that stereotype. And that's related to 2 decades of research demonstrating that when an individual identifies with a group, for instance, race or gender, as part of their social identity, and that group is stereotyped in negative ways, the person is at risk for lower performance relative to the stereotype dimension of that identity. So basically, when I read this, the way I thought about it is almost like feeling super pressured. So for instance, a good analogy might be if you were in a situation like you had to give a speech about something very personal and somebody beforehand said, you're a woman, I know this is going to be difficult, it's going to be really hard for you to keep your emotions in check, but you really need to do that. You would be more likely to get emotional and cry than you would to keep your emotions in check, because that negative stereotype was pressuring you to act in that certain way. So it almost does the opposite. And she talks about how that affects test taking and all kinds of things. lots of statistics there. I'm not going to read all of them because it's already pretty long because this was a very long chapter. But to close, the paragraph reads, the outcomes of numerous studies lead to this conclusion. Quote, by encouraging students to adopt a malleable view of intelligence, either through directly teaching students about this perspective or by creating learning environments that embrace the incremental view rather than entity view of intelligence, we can help students overcome stereotype threat. We can shift a student's focus from the anxiety of proving ability in the face of negative stereotypes to the confidence of improving with effort despite the negative stereotypes. Embracing a theory of intelligence as something that can develop, that can be expanded through effective effort, is something all of us can do to reduce the impact of stereotype threat and increase the achievement of all of our students. So important. It was a really good chapter. And I'm very excited about Wednesday's reading because we're going to be going into chapter 5, which is racial identity in adulthood. And most of the people that listen to my content or watch my content, we fall into the adulthood realm. So not the adolescent realm, although we might have children, nieces and nephews, or we might be in education, healthcare, or instances where we work with those populations. But most of us fall into the adulthood. And the sections, I'm just going to tell you all so you'll be excited with me. But these sections for the racial identity in adulthood are not for college students only, cycles of racial, ethnic, cultural identity development, so how those things can happen in cycles. And this one's my favorite, the corporate cafeteria. I'm so excited to read that one. And talking about how corporate America is going to, I can already tell, it's going to be the same as the cafeteria in high school, where we like float to what we know and we don't learn anything that way. But worse, because we're adults and we think we know ourselves so well. But do we? And if you do think that you know yourself really well, how likely are you to change that perception of yourself? Like, what would it take for you to think to yourself, maybe I believe that too. Maybe I could believe that too. And when was the last time you did that on some of the big issues? When was the last time that you had what you thought was a deeply ingrained value about yourself or the world, and you realized that maybe you didn't believe that anymore? And if it's been a while, I think that that shows some complacency. And that's just my opinion. It's nowhere in this book. If you haven't examined what you believe and really thought it through and listened to others with multiple viewpoints, maybe you're complacent. Maybe you need to do some inner soul searching, quite possibly. And if you're not, then you're staying stagnant. And if we don't educate ourselves, we can't educate our children and we can't change anything. Come back next time. And today is Trans Day of Visibility. So please remember to post about that and amplify the voices of trans people. Please follow them on social media, at least if you don't know any personally, and amplify and support them. All right. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you back on Wednesday. Bye.